Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm Lori Adams Brown, and this is a podcast for those who are different and want to make a difference. Does it feel like your whole world has just been turned upside down? Are you having trouble remembering to drink water or eat? Does it feel like you're walking in quicksand? You can't even concentrate on normal things? You may be walking through trauma. There may be a crisis in your life or in your government that is causing you to feel that you don't know how to put one foot in front of the other. I have walked through times like this, and it really has helped me to walk with a professional therapist through these times. I highly encourage you to find a therapist, and at betterhelp.com/difference, you can get 10% off your first month today. I myself have benefited from a therapist I've worked with there. You can message your therapist in between sessions, go to extra courses around grief or trauma, find support groups, and also really have a person to help you walk through some of the most difficult parts of your life right now. You can get 10% off your first month today by going to www.betterhelp.com/difference. You deserve to heal. Today, we are excited to revisit the most downloaded episode of last year featuring the remarkable Tia Levings. Tia is a writer, advocate, and storyteller whose work shines a light on the intersection of patriarchy, faith, and abuse, drawing, unfortunately, from her own lived experiences within fundamentalist religious environments. She explores the utterly damaging impact of authoritarian systems on individuals and families, including her own, offering a powerful and eloquent voice for those seeking liberation and healing. On August 6th last year in 2024, Tia released her debut book, A Well-Trained Wife, a deeply moving memoir, so well written, very, very carefully crafted, that explains and chronicles her own personal journey of survival, resilience, and self-reclamation. The book quickly became a bestseller. No surprise to me who had an advance copy. This book, I'm telling you, is incredibly well written. She really brings you into her world in a very visceral way. It's been resonating with readers worldwide because of its honesty, incredible vulnerability, and courage beyond belief, and profound insights into what happened to her, how she escaped, and how she helps others find those same tools to move forward. Through her writing and advocacy, Tia empowers others to recognize and confront the dynamics of control and abuse, whether it's in relationships, religious institutions, or societal systems. Tia's work continues to inspire and transform lives, including many of yours that listened to that episode. It was our most downloaded, and it reminds us all of the power of reclaiming our stories. So get ready to dive back into this incredible conversation with Tia Levings. Many of you saw her, as I did initially, on the Shiny Happy People documentary that was on Amazon Prime, which featured IBLP, Bill Gothard, and the family, the Duggars, that were on a reality show years ago. Tia Levings, this episode that she was on with us last year, not only is our most downloaded, but it has touched countless hearts and minds and continues to make a difference. So listen once again to the utterly spectacular, the remarkable person who has not only survived, but is helping others know how to escape and survive too. And just the truly kind and outstanding human being that Tia Levings is. Welcome back, Tia Levings. Hi, Tia. A very warm welcome to the A World of Difference podcast today.
So great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's an honor. Thank you so much to your publisher as well, who reached out to me about your book, which I have been reading on planes and trains and on my couch sitting by the fireplace. And, you know, a book like this that goes so deep into some really hard topics. I found myself needing some kind of body work for myself, that warm, cozy blanket, that warm mug, that ambience that helped me feel safe and process what you're talking about. But I just thank you for how brave and vulnerable you were to write this book, which I know is going to make a difference for so many people. It has for me. But to begin with, I'd really like to, for people who don't already know who you are, just give us a brief overview of who you are and kind of why you wrote this book.
Yeah. First of all, I will say I'm so glad that you took self-care around the book. When people read it quickly, I get nervous for them, for their nervous systems. So I'm really grateful that you honored your body and your needs. So my name is Tia Levings. I wrote A Well-Trained Wife, which is the story of how I got into and then escaped from Christian patriarchy, which is a very high control religion and a violent marriage. A lot of people interact with my work online. That's how they first see me, through either Amazon's Shiny Happy People or my platform, which educates on the abuses in Christian fundamentalism and other high control religion. And I write the Anti-Fundamentalist, which is a Substack on deconstructing fundamentalism as it relates to our headlines, politics, family, faith process, spirituality, anything. Because fundamentalism and fundamentalist attitudes can be in anything. So um, that's my day job. That's what I work on. The book comes out in August, which is why I'm on the podcast circuit.
Yes, exactly. We want people to pre-order. So that's one of many pitches we're going to give, or at least me. Yeah. No, I'm excited to promote this book because there are many listening in this community that are in some very concentric circles from what you write about. In fact, I first heard about you when I watched Shiny Happy People, which covers, IBLP and Gothard and, all these things that, until I watched that documentary, I didn't realize how the concentric circles related to Southern Baptists and all of that. But I know there are Southern Baptist listeners to this podcast. There are also people who are of many different faith backgrounds who may have experienced fundamentalism within Islam or Judaism or a variety of other places. And so as we kind of unpack this together a little bit and you talk about fundamentalism itself, maybe it's good just to give a little bit of a definition. What do you mean when you say fundamentalism, and how would people recognize it?
Yeah, I really simplify this definition. I've heard some like Theo Bro type guys get into really lengthy explanations of what fundamentalism is, but my take is any kind of pure ideology that's valued over people. So if you are pursuing the purity of an idea over someone's humanity or over need or imperfection, and there's usually a formula for happy living attached to it. And then if you do A plus B equals happiness, that's fundamentalism. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, sorry. We broke up for a second.
There's a
I
lag.
think it can be very disorienting for people who have been given a very pure form of their ideology or faith or religion, and then
Mhm.
having these very confusing elements that come in sort of sideways. And that's sort of, your story. And it's the story of many people listening to this. And so I think one of the things in the book that, really kind of shocked me in the first few pages was like, you're talking about people that, um, I didn't necessarily know personally, but I knew people who were in Jacksonville, Florida, for example. I know people whose stories relate to Jerry Vines at First Baptist Jacksonville, and that's like a huge part of your story. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, I'd love to just touch on that for a little bit because as you were a child, you moved to Florida, and you
Mhm.
end up in this church, which is how many city blocks was it again?
We had 11 city blocks of property in downtown Jacksonville, and it was the first big mega church in the Southeast. It was a very large, mainstream congregation. We had two pastors. One of our pastors was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. So when people like handle my story and they're tempted to think that it's fringe, I think it's really important to remember I grew up in an ordinary Southern Baptist church in mainstream America, and that is exactly how extremist views enter. That's the
Mhm.
environment where they thrive, is in a congregation full of very earnest people who want to do the right thing with their life. They're looking for ways to have happy lives, happy families, good marriages, protect their kids, and they're listening to external sources on high to tell them how to do that. It's the perfect petri dish for fundamentalism to grow. Couple that with, in the late 80s and 90s, the rise of Bill Gothard and his evangelistic method of recruiting within churches, and it was like a perfect storm.
Yeah, absolutely a perfect storm. And people are so easily sort of groomed into this. And
Mhm.
my husband, he's got a marriage and family therapy master's and he focuses on trauma. And one of the things he often says is people who have experienced trauma lend toward dogmatism. And so
Mhm.
I remember that part of your story where you're a young girl, you're in a new school and new friends, and there's this total horrible guy that your friend introduces you to, and you have this very traumatic experience, and the reaction to that is like How can there be more rules to keep me safe? At least that's my impression.
You froze.
What would you say as you unpack that and you wrote about it, which thank you for writing that. It's so incredibly vulnerable and brave. And I know that so many people are going to see themselves in your story, both for their bodies being objectified and, you know, as a young girl kind of coming into your own and figuring out who you are when you have these systems. It makes it really hard for them to see, you know, through it all. Because if you've been told by a pastor or a youth leader that, you know, your body is shameful and you're supposed to cross your legs, and you're actually such a good writer the way you write this, you find a way to have these rules keep you safe, and everybody around you is expecting you to do that too. So what role do you think this whole trauma and sort of dogmatism response may have had for you as a young child without really a chance to fight against it?
Yeah, I think because it was my entire environment, and I agree with your husband so much there. I think fundamentalism is attractive during times of chaos because it offers an order and a structure. It's very comforting. And that is how it was presented to me. I felt chaotic. I had been traumatized. And yet I was promised by authorities I really trusted that if I just continued down this narrow road and just purified my faith, purified my behavior, that it would result in this beautiful outcome, and that the real burden was on me to conform to that. And I put my whole trust into it, despite numerous opportunities where I was being presented with evidence. It didn't get through because the words were so powerful to me and the promises were so hungered for. And the chaos, the undiagnosed trauma. I mean, like, it's really important to remember we didn't have any vocabulary for that. So I was holding that within my little, 12, 13-year-old mind. That I wasn't trauma informed. I was trauma experienced, and that word didn't exist, and language and people to tell didn't exist. And I internalized the entire choice. Everything that I got into was never anyone else's fault. It was my fault for being the wrong place at the wrong time, or wearing the wrong thing, or thinking the wrong thing, or having disobedience in my heart. And so the message that if I just obeyed the rules well enough, I would be loved and accepted and safe is something that I carried throughout my entire childhood.
Yeah. And I know people listening to this, maybe some women in particular, are really resonating with that part of your story, and they still are carrying it.
Mhm.
Because in general, outside of religious environments, still women are told to be small, to be silent, to defer. But it's really extreme in certain religious environments, especially the one where you were literally just being told to, you know, cover yourself up in how you dress with purity culture, and you were told to, submit, and you use kind of phrases around women being groomed to defer to every man and therefore, be easily preyed upon. And so as you unpack that now, what is some language that's been able to help you process that for yourself and other women that you know?
Well, the entire rewind button was very important. So it's like probably relevant at this point in the story to say that when I started writing the book, it was started as a therapeutic exercise. I had escaped. I was completely broken, such a hot mess of devastation in 2007. And my first therapist suggested I start journaling, and we started naming the things that I went through. And that was powerful, to have words attached to my experiences. But then as we started to look at each experience and say, well, what led you to that decision? And what led you to the one before that? And we went backward and backward and backward over the years. And I'm going through a faith deconstruction process at this point, but it wasn't what I set out to do. I was just retracing my steps and what kinds of influences had led me to make certain choices. Over and over again, I had to go back into this religion that it wasn't my plan. I thought my faith was kind of safe and off limits and separate from domestic violence. And even the language of domestic violence was new to me at this point in therapy, because he had never punched my face. So I didn't think that I had been battered. And so just expanding my whole understanding of what domestic abuse can look like and how it manifests was a season, but then to retrace my steps back into my religious background really emphasized how I had been groomed and conditioned slowly over time to for example, not put my own interests, like not even consider my own interests or my own needs or desires or dreams. Everything had been subjugated kind of systematically, so that there was just no resistance to anything. There was no waiting period or hear yourself think or any of the things that I do today as a healthy person making decisions. That didn't exist when I was a young woman, and I wasn't equipped with any kind of language or role model, or resource, to go to and say, "Hey, is this a good decision I'm making here?" Because the decision was already made for me. I was, for example, I married who I married because he said he was God's best for my life, and I had just spent 18 years hearing that, you will marry God's best for your life, and without any conversation about what that might look like and who he might be, other than my list of qualifications. I have some of that in there too. Like, we were taught to have qualifications for a husband, but it's amazing how
Mhm.
adaptable that list can become when someone says that they want you.
Yeah. And you grew up as a child hearing a pastor talk about his wife who's sitting right there, who was a child when he was, you know,
Yes.
expressing interest. He's 25 years old in seminary, and was it his dad that's like, "Oh, there's this girl in the glee club," and he said she has all the parts in all the right places. It's just so nauseating.
Yeah.
Yeah, how was that to hear that as a child? Like, what was that like to experience that kind of a story from your pastor?
Yeah, the biggest two stories that was just preached over and over again for years. Like, it's kind of hard to imagine, if you have a Southern Baptist background and you're familiar with the culture, to be at church 6 times a week is pretty normal. Do involved in some kind of church activity, and that is your whole world, and everyone around you is hearing the same thing. So the messages that you hear from the pulpit are compounded from multiple directions in multiple ways all the time. And one of those was a short engagement, the value of a very short engagement. Both of my pastors had 2-week engagements, um, so that they could have sex. I mean, that was the reason. Like, the whole thing was to not have sex outside of marriage, so make the engagement really quick. Both of them married, like, prepared girls who had been chosen for them by elders. Like, we don't want to use the word arranged marriage, but in hindsight, you can call a duck, and selected and groomed, and within 2 weeks they were engaged. And so by the time I'm a young woman on this same decision, I'm not, there's no reference in my mind that says a short engagement's a bad idea. That you might want to pause, that there might be good reason for two strangers not to get married. None of that was on the table. So yeah, I mean, it's true indoctrination. There's
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so when that's your narrative, right? And that's what you're being told as a little girl. And you mentioned how women, there's this narrative around women who wanted careers, women who wanted to get married and have babies, and you wanted babies. That's like, but
Yeah.
there's this often narrative that I think we hear, and it's, it comes from Hollywood a little bit too, but I think in a lot of these church settings, it's this whole idea that women are the ones always longing to get married. And yet the narratives don't always match up in the end. It's
Mhm.
stories like your pastor saying he just couldn't, he couldn't wait to get married. He's 25 in seminary, and he's going around hunting for this wife, and she's in high school. My guess is not thinking about marriage in her glee club, right? So often it's the opposite that's true, and I think that's part of just the mass gaslighting that happens, is
Mhm.
that we're told a narrative that is completely different than what the reality is. And so and then also you being groomed, like so many, to defer to men, it really sets you up for these situations. But for
Mhm.
those who haven't seen you in Shiny Happy People, or are just now pre-ordering your book, which is another shameless pitch, we will put links in the in the show notes. Um, Walk us through from the moment you marry this man and then where you end up fearing for your life. How did it go so quickly to something so hard and devastating?
Yeah. So one of the things that happens when you marry someone you barely know is that you don't know what things they struggle with. And there were red flags before we got married. There was a compatibility test that we failed in premarital counseling. It was mandatory premarital counseling. And there was also violence already. So if I had confided in anyone, maybe they would have raised a concern. Um, but what I had on my hands was a young man who could not organize his own life, and he could not handle stress, and he really needed an external locus of control, which the church and high control religion is all too happy to provide. They will give you, that's one of the dangers of fundamentalism. They will give you everything you need externally for the validation that you're on the right path. They'll give you the plan, the rules, the consequences, everything is there. And he really did love theology. So he loved to study. He was under, like for fun, he would read John MacArthur's commentaries and, and collect these big theology books. And he just was, looking back, like not a very normal 21-year-old guy in the Navy, but I could see how he was really trying to be a devout person and a man of God. He really wanted to be that. His ability to handle it and handle stress was not there. So one of the reasons why it became so dangerous so quickly is because he got in over his head with a relationship and a marriage and responsibilities and a job and the trappings of life. And then patriarchy hands this huge plate of responsibility on top of that. And I think this is one of the reasons I really want to, I hope one of the outcomes of my book is the message that in patriarchy, everyone suffers. It's not good for the men either. Like instead of an equal partner, they get this subservient person who defers to them, which just increases their responsibility load. And that's not fair. That's not partnership. That's not mutuality. That's not collaboration. That's not Adam and Eve in the garden. It's none of those things. It's this top-down extra pressure. Well, he couldn't handle it. And his answer, which we were conditioned to do, was to turn to God, turn to church, turn to theology, which deepened our high control theology. What was happening on a wider scale, the backdrop behind us is that the evangelical church was politicizing in the 90s, and it was becoming more fundamentalist on the whole, in part because of Gothard's influence, but there were many influences happening at that time. And then in addition, Reformed doctrines started to come in, which the high control Presbyterians they add Calvinism to this mix. And that's really dark theology to add to somebody who already has a lot of mental illness and already believes in their own depravity to their core. It really darkens my story at that point. And then the lines blur between high control religion and domestic abuse and mental illness. And it just becomes this really tangled braid that there was no escape from. There was no safe place. There was no relief. It was the deeper into theology we got and the deeper we got into these high control groups that were supposed to have all the answers, the darker our lives became. And by the end of that marriage, by the time I'm ready, like I'm about to die at this point in the marriage was 14 years. We were in a high control group, a covenant Presbyterian church that we had to sign a covenant to enter, and we had to be excommunicated from to leave. And it was a congregation of wife discipliners and spankers and homeschoolers where everybody was like minds. That was the term, like we're in a like-minded church. And of course they don't lead with that this is what we do out in the open. You don't find out until you're in it, that how deep you're in it. And yeah, I mean, it was bad. And it was the most extreme part of this whole patriarchal religion that I think people have. But it's, I think, important to remember that's a 14-year span. That's with two really ardent, well-meaning people experiencing something that is way more common than people talk about, because there's shame involved, there's embarrassment involved, there's secrets. And patriarchy, nothing in patriarchy advertises or leads with the truth of what they're, what you're going to get. They lead with the shine. That's why it's called Shiny Happy People. They lead with the beautiful image of the trad life and the shiny happy babies. And who doesn't love babies? Like you said, I wanted babies. I wanted 5 babies. And patriarchy is really good at using the thing that you most want for yourself against you. So motherhood was an easy drug.
Yeah, that's a quote right there. And it's a trap. It's a trap for everyone, isn't it? And so you find yourself in this situation. And I know that, people who are hearing this for the first time, wife spanking cult, that's not something that's widely known. It's not something obviously that's out there in the open, and definitely not in a like Presbyterian circle. You wouldn't even imagine a mainline denomination name like that. You imagine it if you could possibly fathom something so horrific in a very fringe, like you said, cult situation. And so as you have begun to share your story, we do have this situation of this trad. Why? How is this even like a trend? It's so mind boggling at this point. But we have people at the highest levels of our government, and you sort of end the book, kind of talking more about this, but no spoilers,
Mhm,
just another plug as to why you should read this book, because it's not just a friend situation. You're talking
mhm,
about the religious and political atmosphere happening right now in the United States of America, even leading up to this election here in November. And we have players in our own government doing videos in their kitchens, and it's
mhm.
just bonkers. And so, how has your experience in this movement helped you understand some of this trad wife movement and how it's involved in politics and everything?
Well, I can tell you it's terrifying, Lori. The thing that I risked my entire life. I barely escaped with my life and my children. It was a harrowing escape, and I got away and I put my life back together. And now I'm watching the exact same thing that I had ran away from with I lost everything except for my life and my kids. I'm watching that come for my neighbors. I'm watching it play out in the mainstream. I'm watching, like, when Katie Britt gave her State of the Union address with fundy baby voice, which is not our term for it. That's the outsider's term, and I use that when I'm educating. But she revealed her fundamentalist influences through her behavior, and it was the same feeling I had when I saw the Duggars first be on TV. I was like, that is our group. That I know what they're doing behind closed doors. They can't possibly be getting ready to tell America what they really do. And no, they're not. They're selling this beautiful image. She's selling this really clear role definition. She was trying to appeal to our emotions with using her sweet manipulative voice that she puts on, when you're trying to coax and manipulate and gaslight. Watching it play out on the stage is scary because I know exactly what it means. I know what restrictions are coming. We're seeing that in our headlines now. And every time outsiders, especially outsiders who are raised like perhaps with a feminist background or very educated background, they look at it and they think this can't possibly be true. Like, this must be fear mongering, or this must be extremism, and this isn't going to come for us. And it absolutely is, like, coming. Like, Roe is not where they ended. And I said that when Roe ended, like, they're going to come for contraception. They're going to come for women working outside the home. They're going to come for voting. Like, I wasn't allowed to vote in patriarchy, and they talk about that now openly too. So it's do we just have to look at the people who actually lived in Christian patriarchy to know what they have planned for our country and the women here? So women and children are the bottom of the pyramid scheme.
No, absolutely. That's how it works when there's this kind of extreme hierarchical complementarianism that some would refer to it as, but otherwise known as Christian patriarchy, right? But
Hmm.
as you're writing this book and you're unpacking it all these years later, and you're starting to share about your experience through Shiny Happy People and just ways that you're getting your message out there. I'm curious to know what you think. I mean, you just mentioned people that have been raised with feminism are sometimes surprised that this even exists and wondering if it's even truly a threat. But you, on the other hand, have really experienced it. What are some other things that you feel like are myths or things that you're constantly having to correct that seem shocking to people that you're having trouble kind of getting through to people with?
Yeah, well, there's several of those. Well, good question. Um, from inside the church, one of the biggest pushbacks is not all Christians. They love to say, well, not all Christians are this way. And they get really hung up on the labels. And to that, I always say, number one, I never said all Christians. That's important. That's their
Right.
language, not mine. Um, but also enough that where it's the majority influence in the country. And also, how many is too many? What is enough? Like, these are abuses that are happening in plain sight. Um, and the evidence is there. If you listen, as you center survivors and you listen to survivors coming out of patriarchy, our stories are extremely consistent. And the boldest things I've said, the most horrifying things that I've said in my story, my inbox is always full of me too, that happened to me too. Thank you for saying this out loud. I didn't think anybody would ever say this out loud. And I've committed to myself that I will. Like, the only thing I can take from my experience is that I worked through the trauma therapy enough to where I can tell my story without re-traumatizing myself. And I have a responsibility to do so if I see it happening all around me and to my fellow neighbor. Like, I got into this so innocently and I just don't want to give it my entire life. I want to stop it, and the only way to stop it is to tell the truth of what happened. So I will say the thing, these are hard things to say sometimes, and they feel like, embarrassed, but I would rather be a little embarrassed talking about it than watch it happen and watch it play out. It's I think I'm off track with your question a little bit, but that's what I hear the most is like incredulity that it is really real. And I always point back to survivors and say, well, just listen to the people coming out of it. They'll tell you everything you need to know.
Yeah. And, we do have a very imperfect both justice system and I would say just a lack of framework, and especially evangelical spaces to center survivors. It's always pretty much the opposite. What we see centering the perpetrators, the predator pastors, I call them.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I think that the way our justice system works really kind of gives an excuse to churches to not listen to just one survivor, because you always have to have a corroborating story. But it's so
Mm-hmm.
hard for a survivor to come forward ever. And it's really hard even to have that second one, even though a first one's been brave, because when they see the first one come forward, they watch what happens to them, and the rest just tend to shrink back. Like, I don't want to do that, for good reason, right? Like, it's a
Right.
lot to ask. And so as you were starting to tell your story, was that anything that happened to you? Did you feel like you were kind of a lone voice out there for a little while? Did you have any sort of experience with
Mm.
that?
Yeah, for a long time. I mean, my book sold on its 13th draft, and I'd been working on it for 10 years. And during that time, I was like a rising ability to be articulate about it, speak about it, say things online. And I didn't start making reels in video format until 2021. So my platform really changed when I started doing that. But beforehand, plenty of people didn't believe me. Some things that helped were the Me Too movement, where it was being taken more seriously because just the mass, of people saying so, you know, was a convincing tide. Right now in our social media conversation is this: would you rather meet a bear or a man in the woods? And everyone, all the women are like, bear,
Right.
bear, and I have a video. I was on vacation with my friends, and we saw bears in Asheville in the woods, and we rolled down our window, and it was a mama bear crossing the road with her cubs, and I was like cheering her on and talking to her the whole time, and no hesitation in my spirit. And um, the thing is with the bear conversation is that if you are attacked by a bear, no one is going to disbelieve you. If you're attacked by a man, which is statistically way more likely, there's this disbelief that comes with it. And I have to put my focus on the survivors. I have this vision when I was writing my book that there's some woman in her kitchen, and she's feeling really alone and overwhelmed with the amount of abuse she's living in. She doesn't have language for the things that she's experienced, but she knows she's close to the breaking point. And she throws my book into her cart at Walmart. She can't go to a bookstore even, it just happens to be something she can toss in with her milk and bread, and she gets my book. Um, that woman is who I care about more than all the detractors. And like you said, podcasts, like putting it out there where people like they can listen to a podcast maybe in a little more secret, a little more covertly than like watching something on TV or attending a talk or something like that. So yeah, I know, I'm sure there's naysayers, but they're not my business. My business are the people who need to hear from somebody who's been through it and came out on the other side. And a big part of my work is putting language to experiences. So that feeling you have in your gut when you watch the Duggar Family that something's off, what I have the ability to do is tell you why you're absolutely right. It is off. And here's what's going on. And that's just affirmation. That's language and affirmation that they need in order to make their decision and follow their intuition. I feel like that's a big part of what I do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm so excited to think about those women at Walmart getting your book and being able to find someone who's giving language, because I know anyone who's a survivor, so many of the journeys of survivors that I know personally is that once you get language, it helps you see. And I
Hmm.
had a book, a church called Tove, that Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer wrote, that I was being very badly spiritually and psychologically and abused at my church by my pastor. And it was that book that gave me the language. It's like, if you haven't been told what's happening, the gaslighting's still working on you, but the language, it's always the words. It's all in the words, right? And so I'm really
Hmm.
excited for you and your story to help people As you're thinking about those women going to Walmart and shopping with their cart, what are some of the things that you would want to tell them if they do end up listening to this podcast out of curiosity of whether they should keep reading the book?
Mhm. Yeah, one of the things they say about hard memoirs is that if you're holding the book, it has a good outcome. And that can be really good to hold on to when you're struggling through someone's narrative and it's triggering and activating and upsetting. It has a happy ending. If they retained the ability to then come out of it, tell the story, sell it, put it on paper, that whole thing, then that's a triumph all in itself. Um, but really coming and going from it, identifying, being able to relate with elements of the story, maybe not the whole thing. I think one of the things that comes out with my book a lot with people, readers, is that it's so relatable. Even though they didn't experience the exact same thing, they experienced enough of it to be able to relate, and to just not feel alone, like to know that there's solidarity and that the steps that you make towards freedom or towards articulation and understanding your own situation, there are people out here that will understand. They're welcoming. There's community that's building. It's not what it was even 10 years ago to leave, that there's a network and there's life out here. It's not so solitary. I think solidarity is a big thing.
Absolutely. I get this question a lot for myself, having worked through the past 3 years in the aftermath of, through my own CPTSD, which is another thing that's going on around social media with John MacArthur right now, where they're saying it's not real. And that's just even worse. The gaslighting that
Yeah.
your mental health diagnosis isn't real. But for those who have experienced, trauma and religious trauma in particular, who have either PTSD or CPTSD and working through that, that's an experience that I've worked really hard. It's so much work to walk through, right? And it's a longer journey than you ever expect. But there's so many co-healers, I call them, in this movement. It's a very sacred space for me. I
Mhm.
also have had trouble kind of walking into certain churches that trigger my nervous system. And I know that you kind of had that sort of experience too. But if someone is listening and they really don't know how to explain to their family that it's really hard for them to walk back into a religious environment that feels very similar to one where they were, injured in some way, what would you say to somebody listening right now?
First, big hugs. That's a very hard place to be. Family faith traditions tend to be so laden with emotions and baggage and memories, and especially if you're the mom figure in that scenario, you're expected to help hold things together and overcome, especially like be a good role model to your kids and things like that. Um, it is, though, one of the most primary ways you can self advocate and stand up for your own bandwidth and health. And um, once I realized in my own journey that continuing to go into those environments, knowing what it was doing to me, was active self harm, that changed my ability to be assertive about it. Growing into the ability to self advocate was a process of probably a 10-year process of being able to just stick up for myself and my feelings and allow the follow up, which is immediate, someone else's discomfort. Someone else is uncomfortable because I have to make this stand, and they're probably disappointed and hurt, and they're going to let me know that. And I'm a people pleaser, and I come from, deep entrenched codependence. It's part of the religious tradition we get.
Mm,
And so it was very hard for me to allow someone else to sit with their own discomfort, because I was no longer going to be the one embodying all of the discomfort so that they could feel comfortable. Um, which that it played a really big role in my second marriage. And my second marriage ultimately did not succeed. So I'm careful when I'm giving out advice, like I'm not promising you results, except that I'm happier, healthier, and a stronger self advocate for having gone through that journey. Ultimately, a partner that loves and cares about you is going to support the fact that you can't go into an environment that's harming you. Period. End of
mm,
story.
yeah, that's good advice. And I'm really so sorry to hear about your marriage ending over that. And at the same time, just so, um, grateful that you're giving language to people who are having to choose what it means to heal. And that's very nuanced and it's very complicated. And I actually found your story, even though it's your story, it's no one else's story, and you're at the center of it because it's you. And at the same time, like any good story, we always find ourselves in someone else's story. And I think that as people hear yours, they're going to find ways to find the freedom and the transformation that they need. And it means what got you here is it's going to help you get to the next phase. And sometimes, unfortunately, relationships end and friendships, in my story, it's betrayal of friends who were my pastors and coworkers and friends. And those relationships and friendships had to end, but I had to find new ones. And fortunately, there are new ones, people who care about your healing and your safety. And so any advice for people who are rebuilding relationships? Because I find that can be one of the more difficult parts of these kinds of stories of religious trauma, is
Mhm.
finding new people. It's one of the reasons people stay and never leave, is because they don't want to lose their people. And yet finding new people can be something they don't trust themselves to do because they chose people that harmed them in the beginning. So are there any words of wisdom of what you've learned in your journey about how to choose those new safe relationships coming out of it?
Yeah, first and foremost, I mean, this might seem a little indirect at first, but I promise it will get there. First and foremost is yourself, the relationship that you have with yourself. And what I actually did was I took myself on a big trip, a very, very large travel trip, where I just really finally got one-on-one with myself, and I loved myself, and I realized I would rather be alone than with anyone who's making me miserable or sidelining my needs or um, not valuing, who I am and what I bring. And the uncomfortable truth with that is that very often I was asking others to do for me what I was not doing for myself. And that's why time with myself and really getting to the bottom of all the self-worth stuff that comes up through this, it was so important. Um, and it put into context all the rest of my relationships. I have something called the top 10, which is the top it's 10 very safe people that I have in my life that I know I can go to, and some of them are friends and some of them are professionals. So I have like a top 10 therapist, a top 10 attorney, a top 10 PR person, writing coach, and then I have friends, and those that posse is one thing, one kind of friendship. And then I have other contacts that in the past I might have gotten too personal with too quickly, or I would have looked to have too tight of a bond with, or I would have just co-opted quite a bit of my self-care into different relationships, including my partnership, my most intimate partnerships. Like, I really think that's one of the things about being in codependent recovery is understanding what you need is your responsibility first. And my book opens, with this realization I made that I had to save myself. There wasn't a savior coming. I was my kid's only advocate, the only adult in the house, and if I needed rescue, it was up to me to save me. And that was important to get me out of violence, but then it still took me the past 14 years to realize that that's almost a confrontation every day. I cannot co-opt my needs to others, and I cannot expect them to do for me what I'm just not willing to do for myself. Um, and that's not to say I'm like hyper independent and can take care of all my needs. I think interdependence is beautiful, and we do need people. But it has freed my friendships and it's freed my relationships to not be so needy all of the time in ways that I really need to be taking care of myself, and they need me to be taking care of themselves. No one wants that extra baggage. They want a friendship. They want mutuality and reciprocity.
Great advice for people who are struggling with that whole codependency piece. And it's great to hear that wisdom from you and all that you've learned in your journey. There's one part of the book I wanted to read, and it is toward the end, but it's not a spoiler because it's not giving
Mhm.
anything away other than the fact that people could have known this on their own. But it's just the way you worded it, which I felt was really just insightful in light of everything that's going on and why your book is so important. We start out with this church that's like huge. It's in multiple city blocks, and it's so huge, not just physically, but it's ginormous in your life and your experience spiritually and with your relationships and your family and everything. And it's this First Baptist, Jacksonville, and you say First Baptist failure was too sad to gloat about, in the sense that they had reduced themselves to a city block, right? But also relieving. it hadn't all been bad growing up in an evangelical megachurch. On the other hand, their negligence to prepare us for the real adult world had nearly cost me my life. I don't know how to register my feelings, a sensation my therapist called discomfort. She said I needed to sit in it to let it be. And I think that, reading those words, and once again, you're just such a great writer, and I read a lot of books, so that's like saying
Thank
something.
you.
You're welcome. But just that whole image, and I know you said you're a very visual person, which has its own, challenges for people who are hearing songs and hymns about blood. And I have other friends that really struggle with that as children as well. But the imagery of this church literally shrinking, that was just everything.
Mhm.
Um, and and just seeing how so many of these empires fall when they've been so controlling in these religious traumatic experience. And so, um, as that is happening and your therapist is helping you learn to sit in the pain and suffering, one of the things I've seen in evangelicalism and in religious traumatic experiences within evangelicalism is a lot of people don't have the theology of suffering that would help them get through that, and also don't have an ability to sit in the pain and suffering in order to grieve and move through that. And so what would you tell someone listening right now who just wants to keep their head in the sand and pretend it's not happening, and move on?
That's a great question. Triggers are information, and when you're feeling triggered or activated and you're uncomfortable, and if you have zero tolerance for that, if it's just too painful, that is actually very powerful information that there's a lot more to unpack than you realize. There's something happening there. There's history there. That's when I would run, not walk, to my therapist and start uncovering things. Um, that intolerance is a nervous system response. It's your body's way of protecting you so that you're in survival mode. And um, yeah, I mean, the second half of that is when you put your head in the sand and then you're just in denial. That is an option to you. That is available to you. You can deny as a coping mechanism, but I would beg people to realize that you are harming yourself when you do that. You are now becoming a self perpetuator of whatever hurt you. Um, because healthy psychological well being does have tolerance to sit with something that's uncomfortable. Um, a mature adult human being is able to sit in a certain amount of discomfort and face the stresses of their lives and identify problems and come up with solutions. And so, if you're unable to do that, you just shut down. That's really alarming. It's common. We all have been there, but yeah, it's that's information to take very seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we're finishing up here, I do want you to give us a chance to find where people can find you and your book, but I also want to give you a chance to say any last words to the audience listening around the world, about, the message that you're trying to bring.
Yeah, I think that because evangelical outreach has been so pervasive and global, that the reach for this is and the impacts are much more widespread than one little American lens. And I think that if you find yourself relating to parts of the story, that I urge you to examine places where you may have religious trauma in your life, and to know that you're not alone and to feel that solidarity. And I'm a big, huge proponent in healing, that you deserve to heal, and that trauma took your past, but it does not get to have your present and your future too. And you are the one in charge of that. So I'm working on my second book now, and that's my entire focus, is how I took my life back and how I regained my voice, and I became someone who could talk about really hard things. When I left, I could hardly speak. I couldn't, I stuttered, and I couldn't tell my story, and I didn't know what had happened to me, and I was completely broken. And the woman that you meet today online is not that same person. Um, and I hope that people take encouragement from that and solidarity. As for finding me, I'm everywhere online at Tia Levings Writer. My website is tialevings.com, and my Substack is tialevings.substack.com.
Thank you so much for the difference you're making and for bringing your differences to the table today. Tia, you are just really a voice to listen to, and you've made a huge impact on me. And I really am excited for people to get their hands on your book, A Well-Trained Wife, My Escape from Christian Patriarchy. Thanks for being with us today, Tia.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.